I'd like to just begin with a quick introduction. Again, my name is Dane Carlson, and I'm a landscape designer and sometimes researcher, operating for the most part in Nepal. And this research was fortunately funded and supported through a Fulbright student grant via the U.S. State Department, so for that I'm very grateful. So today I want to address a very complex issue regarding marginal populations, specifically a population of herders in the highlands of Nepal's Trans-Himalayan district of Mustang. And in this space, herders occupy a very strange in-between. And this is kind of a pseudo-belonging, which really serves to obscure their agency in the landscape, denies them citizenship in the process, I would argue. And I think one of the mechanisms through which this is not enforced, I mean kind of perhaps unconsciously enforced, is the current understanding of tradition in this place. And this is a tradition which is very closed, limited, undynamic, and only available to people who have been born into an existing landed established caste. So herding practice in the highlands of Nepal, as across many of the highland regions of the world, is a critical part of life. And in Mustang, for example, every village is located in a river valley lowland and has a huge amount of accompanying rangeland, throughout which herds of yaks, sheep, and goats range across the year. This is one of the shelters within which they stay over the course of the year, rotating the grazing land. All these shelters are roofed because it's a very common occurrence for snow leopards to eat livestock. And often, unsurprisingly, these herders, which are, again, a very marginal population, are often held financially culpable for losses incurred through predation. So, in case you didn't know where it is, this is Nepal. And so, to place us geographically, we're in the district of Mustang right here, which historically was the main salt trade route between highland Tibet and middle Nepal, and specifically in the region of lower Mustang. And just a quick note, Mustang is geographically formed by the Kali Gandaki River Valley. So Mustang is a place of great contrasts, as is most of Nepal. Yeah, exactly right. So in the village of Santak on the left, there's no electricity, no toilets. Road was only built last year. And in the village of Kagbeni on the right, the Wi-Fi cafe at Yak Donald's. So essentially the emergence of a new landscape has really started to unfold here very recently. Mustang was only open to the outside world in 1993. This is a road to the pilgrimage site at a place called Muktinath, and it's been recently paved and stained with goat urine. And so you can imagine the amount of livestock casualties that occur as jeeps and buses kind of careen down these roads during the tourist season. So this has become, due to recent infrastructural interventions, which essentially just site themselves right on top of the existing practices, largely a landscape defined by conflict and uncertainty. And of course, unsurprisingly, marginal populations such as low-caste herders find themselves directly in the middle. So the herders of Mustang are a very diverse group of people. They are all men, they are all low-caste, but they're from any and every part of Nepal, some from mountain districts, some from the Middle Hills. But one thing that they share is that they have a very fragmented tenure. This is not what you would call a traditional practice. It does not have a deeply rooted history of continual turnover, but because of varying demographic changes, which I won't get into now, it's very common for herders to stay in the mountains for only a single season, perhaps several years. It's very rare for them to stay for longer than that amount of time. So essentially these herders operate in a land they're not raised in, where they have almost no social or economic capital. And their agency is unrecognized, and essentially they possess a citizenship that is almost invisible according to prevailing narratives. However, the agency that they do possess, is obviously rooted in the knowledge that's expressed in embodied practice and shaped by the experiences of daily life. So these herders, essentially find themselves simultaneously separate from the embedded cultural narratives of place, which are, according to many people, thousands of years old. This is often understood to be a landscape that is dominated by a monolithic Tibetan Buddhist culture. These people are not Tibetan Buddhists, generally speaking. So they're separate from those narratives. However, they find themselves inseparable from social hierarchies, labor practices, and established livelihoods. As I mentioned earlier, tradition is one of the mechanisms through which this invisibility of agency and the lack of citizenship is enforced. This is a ritual in which the villagers of this particular village called Tini circumambulate the village and kind of as a result are claiming and identifying territory. This ritual is only, and this ritual as well, which is a claiming of fields through the regeneration of village deities, is only available to landowners and homeowners. Herders don't own land, they don't own homes, and as a result do not play a role in the claiming of territory and are separate from it. So what I would argue essentially is that these people do not belong to this tradition as it is seen as a static entity, and as a result are not allowed to, at least through the common cultural narrative, to belong to its landscape. Herding is certainly, as I think we all know, a long-established practice in many of the rangelands, the high rangelands of the world. And like I said, the complexity here is that there is a continuing fragmentation of this practice through a constantly revolving tenure, which is not by any means a condition shared by the other rangelands of Nepal. And this is kind of compounded by climate change. And one of the things that seems to occur in mountain regions is that climate shifts at much more dramatic rates than it does in lowland regions. Imagine essentially that you are hired. This is how this commonly occurs. You're hired, you are shown where to sleep, where the animals are, and left in the highlands by yourself. There is very little transfer of knowledge, and that on top of that, the practice that you might come to understand through the course of a year is then dramatically different as the next year rolls around. It doesn't snow, it barely rains. All of these complexities compound the vulnerability and the lack of belonging, or the lack of recognized belonging, I would say, of this population. So I think this is particularly interesting in the context of Tim Ingold's assertion that, and this is a brutal paraphrasing, but that knowledgeability consists in the development of the capacity to understand our environments by having things shown to us. But what if someone were put in an environment, essentially not shown the landscape, not told about the landscape, had no historical place within the landscape, speaking in a broader cultural narrative? We're from a place in the lower plains or the mid-hills of Nepal, and we're essentially left to our own devices. How would you develop that capacity to understand the landscape? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think essentially it's through the discovery of knowledge through the patterns of daily life. And one other point that I just want to enforce here is that I think that there's a need to challenge the notion of tradition as a static object that is obtainable. That is essentially broadly, popularly defined as a language and a religion and a set of clothes or something like that. And that instead tradition is a process that occurs over time that consists of dialogues between the past, between the present, and the future. And that herders are irrefutably members of a dynamic tradition in which continuity and change are mutually generative. And though they may not belong to a centuries-long history of place by birth, they do exercise agency within and belong to a landscape generated by this history. And so essentially, I think that redefining tradition, which in many ways is kind of created by the tourist industry in this place, which is often marketed as the lost Himalayan kingdom, is a really damaging kind of engine that indirectly strips people of their ability to exercise visible agency and create citizenships, demonstrate citizenships. And this is also demonstrated by a pervasive mistrust. As anybody familiar with the caste system would know, many of the landowners are higher caste, temporary transitional laborers are lower caste, and they're, for many reasons, kind of the results of a long embedded social hierarchy extreme amounts of distrust between lower caste and higher caste people, especially in this situation, in which lower caste people are often blamed for losses and made financially culpable for those, despite the fact that they're paid very little. So these are the rangelands of the village of Teeny. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a very small village footprint down here on the left, and all of the names of the village rangelands are highlighted in white with in black text. And so essentially over the course of a year, herders rotate through these rangelands. One of the interesting things about the herders of Teeny, at least as of last year, is that none of them had been here longer than 6 years, many less than a year. And so the dramatic shifts that had occurred in the village rangelands recently, there has been a significant reduction in fodder availability. None of them were essentially heirs of that transition. They were hired out of the blue and plopped into the place without having any understanding of the gradual evolution of this practice. So, and one of the points that I made earlier, the idea of pseudo-belonging, I think is something that is very clearly represented in this rangeland called Batang by, as you can see here, two doors, one here on the right and the other on the left. The one on the right, as you may be able to see, is essentially a brand new wooden door with a brand new padlock and a bolt, and the door on the left is just an opening in the stone wall covered by a heavy blanket and a tarp. The one on the left belonging to the herder, the one on the right belonging to the goats. The investment is, of course, of paramount importance here. So almost every condition that is faced by this group of people compounds vulnerability in some way. They are often forced to perpetuate destructive resource collection practices. There is a significant amount of overgrazing that has begun to occur, largely because snowfall has decreased dramatically, fodder as a result has declined dramatically, and so overgrazing is the result. There's also a significant amount of predation. Snow leopards are a common predator here, and as the climate begins to warm, leopards have come up from the highlands, and it's also common in birthing season for eagles to hunt kids and drop them off cliffs. So this is an example. This is a herder who's staying in the shelter we mentioned earlier. This is about a 2-hour walk from the shelter, and they've decided to take the extreme risk of leading their goats into this forest. And as you can imagine, forests are perfect places for leopards to hide and eat your goats when you're not looking. So the predation that results from essentially this, the dynamic of the predator-prey relationship, simply speaking, serves to compound the mistrust that already exists between herders and the owners of their flocks. Because not only does it compound the herders' vulnerability by reducing their earnings, but it often leads to the laying of blame at their feet by the owners of the herds. One other thing that I should mention here is that this video is quite long, but another thing that the herder, this particular herder, is doing throughout the course of the day is cutting and gathering grass, largely because there have been increasingly unpredictable snowfalls. And 2 years ago, there were 3 meters of snow that fell over the course of 2 days. They were snowed in for a week, and half of their livestock died. So they are then required to, in a sort of an effort to adapt to this circumstance, to cut grass often, to dry it, and to have it on hand in case such an emergency should occur. And that was not a common occurrence in the past. So this extreme variability caused by essentially the changing climate has served to provide another source of vulnerability. Here is another, the rangelines of another village, a little bit higher up, and as you can see, there's much less vegetation here. This is a heavily overgrazed landscape. And not to mention the fact that there is a vicious wind in Mustang that blows up from the Kaligandaki River Valley on a daily basis. The sun is very intense. There's almost no moisture in the soil as a result. And so one of the things here you'll see, just as a quick footnote, there are these horseshoe-shaped shelters that the herders will hide in to protect themselves from the wind. But these herders in this particular village are all responsible for harvesting their own fuel. And you can imagine in a landscape like this, there's almost nothing available other than these shrubs, which are the goats' food. So as you can see in this video, it's very common practice for them to have no other option than to walk through the rangelands, uproot the shrubs, burn the roots in order to cook their own lunch and their dinner. And as a result, unsurprisingly to anyone, this is a very self-defeating process. However, there is no alternative option. Another common practice during the winter is the burning of these shrubs, all of which are really heavy thorn bushes, essentially to melt the snow, have a place to sit, and stay warm in the middle of the winter. Infrastructure, I think, is another interesting component of these landscapes, and I also think, especially in this example, kind of a method through which herders actively demonstrate their agency and, I think you could argue, demonstrate or present a case for their citizenship in this landscape. If you can see on the left, there's a black pipe running through this high pass, which provides water to the village below. And what a particular herder has done is channel the water that's leaking out of that pipe into a series of small ponds. And so instead of having to water his goats in this deep ravine over here, in which there is a very high risk of mortality or broken legs, they can instead water themselves on the plateau. And these are just several smaller examples of the ways in which embodied practice as kind of a process of knowledge making in the lives of these herders is formed in the landscape. On the right, a shelter that's used to protect kids during the birthing season. On the left, a shrine and a wind shelter. And finally at the shelter, this one is called Brapsa. And the herder that was living here was essentially taken largely against his will up to this rangeland, 15 years old, by the owner of a flock who didn't tell him the conditions of the place, what he would be doing, and was essentially left here to work for the entire winter. So I think basically all of these conditions, and a baby goat for your enjoyment, all of these conditions really serve to illustrate the fact that all of the relationships between herders and the communities in which they live and work are an ever-evolving cocktail of trust and mistrust, belonging and not belonging, even sometimes consent and non-consent. And this I think, drives, and was an opinion or a thought often echoed by the herders themselves, that because of these situations, many are driven to leave after a single season. So there is no conclusion. The conclusion at this point is a very open question. I think grazing practice is largely on the decline, and so the questions regarding the future of this landscape are intriguing, and thank you very much for your attention.